Hi, Indradeep.
Hi.
Indradeep is the executive director at Dwara Research. So, would you like to kick us off before I ask questions?
Right. So I think um, maybe I'm one of the few people who are actually saying this out loud. But I believe that public policy is in crisis today.
Mhm.
I believe that the problems that public policy has been trying to solve, not just in India but all around the world, problems like rising inequality, stagnating economic growth, environmental damage, public health. I feel like all of these problems are getting more complex,
Mhm.
more amplified, more insoluble over time.
Mhm.
And I feel that, a rather telling statistic is that of the 150 plus SDG metrics, we just learned in 2023 that progress on a full 30% of those
Hmm.
metrics
Hmm.
has either stalled or reversed, and progress on another 40% of those metrics is weak. So it's very unlikely that we are going to hit these targets by 2030. And in fact, global leaders have described the situation in SDGs as a moment of reckoning.
Hmm.
So, despite all of this, I find that there is a kind of denial that this is where we've got to with public policy. There is a replication crisis in public policy. Policy insights from one context do
Hmm.
not transpose easily to other contexts. So I do think that public policy is in crisis, and really, what I am thinking about is, okay, what's the central problem here?
Hmm.
And what I think is the central problem is that there is no role for culture
Hmm.
in public policy. And this is particularly troubling when you consider that both politics and public policy are downstream from culture,
Yeah.
right? So, and culture is how people make meaning in
Yeah.
their lives. And so I feel that public policy is culture blind. That is not to say that public policy is not influenced by culture. It
Hmm.
is influenced by culture because
Hmm.
it cannot be any other way. Like I
Hmm.
just said, public policy is downstream from culture. But it is influenced by culture in a non reflexive, unself conscious manner, meaning that culture is influencing public policy, but public policy has no awareness
Hmm.
that culture is influencing it. And so this lack of awareness about a critical source of influence
Hmm.
is actually, I think, the problem with public policy. And I think that public policy needs to fix this problem.
Okay. So, what change would you like to see in how contemporary public policy functions?
So I think that basically you need to reintroduce culture
Hmm.
into the public policy discourse. You need to first accept that public policy is downstream from culture. You then need to accept that there is a replication
Hmm.
crisis in
Hmm.
public policy. You need to accept the limitations of behavioral science in public policy. No doubt, behavioral science has made a significant contribution to public policy over the last 20, 25 years.
Mhm.
But I think that we are also now beginning to see the limits of behavioral science in public policy, and we can talk more about those limits later on.
Mhm.
But I think the first step is coming to an acceptance
Hmm.
that yes, these are some of the intractable impasses which public policy has reached,
Mhm.
and then to acknowledge that what is missing is really this cultural element. And once you introduce culture into the public policy discourse, then I think a lot of the problems that public policy suffers from, and part of these problems have to do with the economic origins of public policy.
Mhm.
Mostly among the social sciences, it is economics that drives public policy. I mean, the sociologists and the anthropologists have been crying foul for the last 40, 50 years, 70 years maybe. Economists have not cared, and public policy makers have not cared.
Hmm.
But it's basically economics that is driving public policy. And the problem is that when you have the mainstream economic idea that driving public policy, you end up you end up making public policy, committing public policy mistakes. So what are
Sure.
the kinds of mistakes you end up committing? First of all, you end up mistaking the particular for the universal, right? You end up saying that, okay, if this result obtains in this context, then it should also be obtaining in any other context. So there is no, in other words, there's no awareness of context and the important role that context is playing in that particular result that we see in a particular location. So you mistake the particular for the universal, then you end up mistaking explanatory power for predictive power. It's kind of related, right? That
That's right.
what economic theories mainly do is they explain phenomena, but social reality is fundamentally the site of novelty, which means that human beings, being fundamentally creative sentient creatures, we create new things that did not exist before.
Yeah.
And so the ability of social science to predict future phenomena is really very limited. Yet public policy discourse assumes that if I'm able to explain a phenomena here, then I am also able to predict that same phenomena happening in a similar manner somewhere else. The third mistake that happens is that you mistake, you know, rhetorical discourse for representational language. Public policy is fundamentally creative, it is generative, it's not representational. The language of public policy is not like the language of physics. It is not representing a world independent of human activity. In fact, it is trying to represent a world in which humans are active. And so it has to deal with this problem of novelty, this problem of radical uncertainty, etc. And so it has to acknowledge that the language itself is generative, its language itself is creative, it's rhetorical. It's not pure rhetoric, but it is not purely representational either.
Right.
The fourth mistake it makes is that you mistake monetary value for actual value. Okay, if something cannot be translated into monetary value, it doesn't have value. So basically money has usurped the role of all evaluative standards and mechanisms, you know. And that's a problem, because you see in public policy also now, much of the goals and objectives are set in monetary terms, right? There is no higher ethics, there is no higher value system that is involved in informing public policy. And then the fifth mistake it makes is it mistakes economics for ethics.
That's right.
Right, which is related to this point, that there is no role for a discussion about what the ends of public policy should be in terms of abstract values, in terms of abstract ideals that the human race should aspire for. There is just the proximate end, which is let's all grow economically, right? But that idea of compounded rates of economic growth are going to run up against finite ecological constraints. And as long as you have debt financed economic growth, that contradiction is only going to deepen. So I think the way culture can, you know, once you introduce culture back into public policy, what it does is it fixes each of these five problems. You know, you now no longer mistake the particular for the universal, because now cultural context matters. And so now you're sufficiently aware that, you know, this particular result here may not obtain in a different kind of cultural context. You do not mistake explanatory power for predictive power, again, because context matters. You do not mistake, you know, monetary value for actual value. You do not mistake economics for ethics, because now what you allow to happen is you allow culture rather than money to speak ethics.
Right.
You know, right now what is happening is that monetary value is speaking ethics. And so, like I said before, it's not that culture is not influencing public policy. Culture is influencing public policy, but only the very superficial, fleeting, transient aspects of culture that have to do with monetary exchange are driving public policy. So it is the money culture that is driving public policy. And this is happening in a very non reflexive way. And so all of the problems that sort of mainstream economic theorizing suffers from are being imported wholesale into public policy discourse and public policy decision making.
Very interesting. So, what is this culture that you speak about? And if there is no replicability of from one context to another, I suppose of a research idea or a research design, how does one find how a solution is not universal but particular?
Yeah. So first of all, culture is meaning making.
Okay.
Culture is how we derive and make meaning out of our lives and out of our everyday activity. We have to understand that unlike what economists propose, you and I, human
Hmm.
beings, don't behave rationally, we behave meaningfully. Okay. And a lot of the times, the way we behave may not be reasonable
Hmm.
or may not look reasonable to outsiders
Hmm.
from another culture.
Hmm.
But within the culture that we inhabit, those actions, those behaviors carry meaning, and therefore we perform those actions and we undertake those behaviors.
Right.
So, this very, very important insight about how people behave, that we don't behave rationally, we behave meaningfully, and behaving rationally is a subset of that. It's included in that,
Hmm.
but it's by no means the entirety of that,
Hmm.
of how we behave.
Hmm.
Okay. So that's culture. Culture is how we give meaning
Sure.
to our actions, to our lives, to our decisions, etc. Now, yes, so I think one of the is, you are not going to be able to insert culture into public policy and still retain the certain aspects of public policy that perhaps make it an easy discipline.
Hmm.
The idea that the particular can be in fact also treated as the universal makes public policy a somewhat easy analytical
Yeah.
discipline. So we will have to acknowledge, once we introduce culture, that the particular cannot become the universal, but that does not mean that the learning about a particular situation, about how a particular intervention worked, cannot help us in another context or in another situation or in another circumstance. It can.
Hmm.
It just forces us to be much, much more careful about transporting policy insights from one context to another context. It just requires the public policy researcher and the public policy maker to exercise a lot more judgment.
Sure.
And that is where value judgments come into the picture, and that is where culture also matters, because even the public policy maker is entrenched in a cultural context, and so he or she is going to filter whatever
Hmm.
particular result you obtained in some other cultural context, going to filter that result through his or her own cultural context. And then, I'm not saying that nothing that we learned in that other context applies in this context. Some aspects do.
Hmm.
But what are those aspects which can be transported, and what are those aspects which cannot? A discussion can begin about those kinds of issues, which is not happening presently.
Right. So essentially, considering culture necessary for public policy is important, and
Absolutely.
it helps us raise the filter on how
Absolutely.
learnings transpire amongst situations. So you mentioned behavioralism. You mentioned how behavioral science has somewhat helped us do this. And well, I also hear you say that it's not really bridging the gap. So what is lacking in the behavioral science approach, and how can
Yeah.
we make it tighter?
Yeah. So what I'm about to say is, again, uh, going to ruffle up a lot of feathers and annoy a lot of people, because there is this sense that behavioral science has saved economics and it
Hmm.
has saved public policy, that all of the problems of public policy that arose from importing wholesale a rational actor paradigm into public policy have somehow been now alleviated or mitigated by the advent of behavioral science. This is not true.
Okay.
First of all, behavioral economics is a misnomer, because what you think you're going to get when you hear the phrase behavioral economics is, you think you're going to get a formal theory of human behavior.
Hmm.
Instead, what you get is a long catalog of departures from what is clearly a wrong theory of human behavior.
Right.
And a negative list does not constitute a positive
Hmm.
theory. Okay, so that's problem number one
Got it.
for behavioral economics. Problem number two for behavioral economics is that behavioral economists don't understand emotion. They think that emotion is a interruption or a disruption or a corruption of reason, right?
Interesting.
And then they produce this reason emotion binary, and this becomes the seeding ground for papers and papers and papers and experiments and experiments and experiments. And then there's the replication crisis, because those experiments don't replicate. um, the pro, you know the fact of the matter is that even in order to think about something, you need to emotionally invest in that thing,
That's right.
right? And this is called cathexis,
Hmm.
actually, that we are emotionally invested in what we reason about. So reason and emotion cannot be so neatly separated, right? The third problem with behavioral economics is that most of the fundamental public policy challenges today require fundamental behavioral change. Now, if all it took was a nudge, right?
There would be no misbehavior.
If all it took was a nudge,
Yeah.
does that not put the lie to the promise of behavioral economics? Because we are not then really undertaking fundamental behavioral change. And if you think about the big public policy problems of the day, of the contemporary world, they require fundamental behavioral change, right? Behavioral economics is not going to get us there. So I think that behavioral economics matters because how people behave, how people does matter, and we do need to understand, but we need to ground behavioral economics on an understanding of culture. So once you have that cultural piece in place, and then you layer on top of it the insights of behavioral economics, then I think you're going to get a much richer palette of options from which to choose, you know. And so that's, you know, I don't think behavioral sciences is, you know, I think that it has something significant to contribute, but I think that it is oversold.
Interesting. So it's about utils and not rupees, and we should understand that utils aren't nothing, I guess.
Well, it's not even about utils, you know, because the whole idea of a utility function is itself very problematic.
Okay.
Think about it this way: since you've studied economics, you will appreciate what I'm about to say. See, there is a paradox at the core of economic theory, and that paradox is that economic theory promises to discover laws by which a sovereign actor behaves. Now, that's paradoxical, right? Because on the one hand, you're saying the actor is sovereign. On the other hand, you're saying that, but the actor subscribes to or can be conforms to laws. Now, the way economic theory solves this paradox is it solves it in a very slipshod, counterfeit manner. It says that the individual must maximize utility, and to that extent, the individual, we can discover laws. You know, so once you posit a utility function, then the whole business of deductive theory can commence. But there is also a refusal to discuss what goes inside the utility function, and to that extent sovereignty is preserved. But this, I would argue, is a slipshod counterfeit resolution of the paradox, because what it does is it hides under the carpet any discussion of ends, because that is what goes inside the utility function. But the economist throws up his hands and says, I don't want to have that discussion because that's a sovereign actor, and the actor can decide what he will put in the utility function. So in the utility function, we put x and y, or x1 and x2, and no proper discussion happens about ends. And this is why public policy as well as economics mistakes economics for ethics, because there is no proper conversation about ethics.
Very interesting. It's been amazing to pick your brain in the Z.
Yeah,
Thank you
thank
for
you.
this.
Thanks.